So I've been thinking a lot about the trad movement lately. I just recorded a nice long conversation on development of doctrine with Andrew Bass from the Myriosity channel, and when I was on the Myriosity channel last, we had talked about the trad movement. I've made a stream about theological retrieval. I'm thinking a lot about all these things, thinking about different denominations, thinking about people I know. So I kind of wanted to share some of my thoughts in this video. First, if you don't really know what the trad movement is, then I feel like this video you're going to be totally lost. So that's my warning. Generally, I'm talking about young, mostly male, but not all exclusively male, people kind of coming back into Christianity. There definitely is a wing of this with Islam too, but I'm not going to be talking about that in this video. And a lot of these kind of trad guys, they like kind of cool edits of Christian stuff. I have this image of Baldwin the Fourth, who was a king of Jerusalem. There's a lot of crusade imagery in this kind of sphere. And not for nothing, I would kind of consider myself adjacent to this, if not just totally in this group of guys. On here on the internet, I think there's a lot of people disillusioned with modernity, a lot of people disillusioned with modernism, a lot of people disillusioned with liberalism, and so they kind of want an alternative, and so they're kind of seeking this trad stuff. And I think there's a lot of good in it. But in this video, I'm going to be talking about some of my thoughts, some of my concerns, some of my things I'm thinking about. Okay. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is you see a lot of people talk about the trad movement as everyone's going back into like Orthodoxy or Catholicism or whatever, but also there is a lot of people just in Protestantism going to the kind of higher Protestant traditions. And something I stumbled upon that made me really think about making this video is this podcast called Reformation Red Pill. I actually do kind of like listening to it. It's pretty interesting, especially when they talk more about theology. But you can tell that all of the guys here have this this trad bent. They're very post mill. They're very proud of being post mill because they think that being post millennial has all these political implications and we're going to win here on earth and all these kinds of things. And I don't disagree. Actually, I'd probably categorize myself as non-millennial. Maybe I'll make a video about that eventually, but I don't disagree with their eschatology, but my thought is they clearly and directly related to politics. Like they think about culture war issues and then postmillennialism. And when they talk about their kind of transition from being kind of normie evangelicals to being Reformation red pilled, if you will. They talk about going into like the historic Presbyterian tradition for these guys, but actually they're part of what's called the CREC, which is the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches. And at first I was like, okay, interesting, and I started looking into the denomination, and I found some weird stuff about it. It basically seems like, and I hope that I'm not, really going out on a limb here. It seems like this denomination exists to be based Presbyterians. You have to be Calvinist, from what I understand, or it's really, really, really recommended you be Calvinist in the CREC. It probably is required, actually. But you can be a Baptist or or Paedo-Baptist. You can be a Credo-Baptist or Paedo-Baptist. You can subscribe to the 39 Articles or the Westminster Confession. You can subscribe to any of those different things. As long as you're Reformed, you get to be in this denomination. And all of the guys in this denomination are post-mill. And basically, to me, I'm like, wait a second. This is a really random set of priorities. Being post-millennial is more important than whether or not you baptize your babies. Being Calvinist even is more important than whether or not you baptize your babies. I can understand a denomination thinking both of those things are important enough to split to have your own denomination over. I don't agree with it. Obviously, I'm Anglican, but I can understand that. But not thinking that whether or not you baptize babies is important. Like, come on, this isn't important. This is one of the most stark dividing lines. People used to get hung over this issue in the past. So it seemed a little odd. But what I started to realize is I do think that it's more representative of a societal split that is real. And a tendency, I've seen criticisms, for instance, of the ACNA and the mainline churches and just the division between evangelical and mainline churches in general, is that you have blue state churches and red state churches. And you have this idea that the kind of apparatuses of our society that are blue, which is a weird way to talk about them, but basically Democrat, left, liberal aligned, more in favor of kind of the global movement maneuvering of society, social progressivism. They have their own churches, and then the rest of America, the kind of red state America, the more America prioritization, local, they've got their evangelical churches. And you can even see that for lots of commentators, you can go on CNN or whatever, and you'll see their hit piece on evangelicals, but really they're just talking about some random small church somewhere else. But they have to attack evangelicals wholesale because subconsciously, in my opinion, what they're doing is they're waging a culture war, and they know that evangelical, that word is coded red, and they're part of Team Blue, and so they have to make an assault on Team Red, whatever. And so the CREC is also kind of this thing. So whether or not that's an accurate description of real denominations on the ground, you can talk about red state mainline churches and blue state evangelical stuff, and Tim Keller is a great example of somebody who's in a city but is a conservative evangelical. Whatever. But I think in some sense the CREC, which actually I think is from like the 90s, has kind of become the home of the kind of trad reformed people, and they got their own denomination because they're kind of an emerging zeitgeist. So you can criticize that element of in my opinion kind of Presbyterian tradition, right, where every little nuanced different opinion kind of gets their own denomination, but that's not what the point of this video is. Instead, I think it's interesting that this is a thing, and you can look at Doug Wilson and the Moscow Mood, and there's this idea that we're gonna kind of take back the culture, and that's an important part of our church, so important that it's a denominational boundary. And in the Protestant world, where that means you split over these kinds of serious issues, which in our society seem very important because they are locally, and this point in history, that produces a new denomination. And I don't know if that would have always been the case, because and here's why I'm very critical of it, and I want to point this out. And I think in my Thawing of Christian Winter video, I touched on this, but maybe I wasn't as clear in that video. I do think this is happening in a lot of ways with people going into the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, and the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, and people doing that are kind of missing the point. You'll see a lot of people that do this. They go into the Roman Catholic Church, and then they don't like Vatican II. They kind of pick and choose because the thing that they wanted out of that tradition was where that tradition was at 100 years ago. Because really, they want to go back to the world and the culture 100 years ago or something like that. And that's the thing that they're clinging to. So anything that from those traditions that resembles not being that way, they reject. And I think that that's a problem because, and I said this in that video, what we actually understand, and even these other traditions I would say would understand at the end of the day, is that there's the one type of error who people who are like, oh, politics doesn't matter, social stuff doesn't matter, cultural stuff doesn't matter, because the gospel's not about that. And I would say that's actually wrong. I do think the gospel touches everything. But that's the thing, it touches everything. It doesn't just serve to solve your individual problem. So if the thing that's really bugging you, that brought you back into Christianity, that, the Jordan Peterson lectures, the Jonathan Pageau videos, the thing that you're really concerned about in our society, which is real, and it's a serious issue, if that's your top priority in the faith, it's going to recolor the way your faith lives itself out, and I think in problematic ways. Because you have to kind of take a bird's eye view of the faith. And this is really what development of doctrine touches on. And that's, I think, the hazard of thinking of your tradition in these kind of very narrow ways. What is development of doctrine? And I talk about this way more in the video that I just made with Andrew. But the development of doctrine is the church that has the one apostolic faith that we've had since the beginning, that we've had since day one, and then that faith ran up against a controversy or a trial or a disagreement in the church, and the church moved forward from that controversy with how the apostolic deposit is applied to that controversy, and then kind of binding that decision to the church. And this has happened over time, and so you can actually see that as social progress has happened in human history, we actually have had to respond to those different things. I mean, just a great example is the invention of contraception. Um, and the church has to respond to that. What would the apostolic deposit say about this issue? And different denominations have their own different takes on this. Different Christians have their own different takes. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Progress is inevitable. Changing is inevitable. And actually, we require a tradition that has addressed these issues in a substantive sense to actually meaningfully address them. This is the error of kind of progressivism, where they kind of see like, oh, the solution to the future is the future itself. We'll just come up with a great new idea to solve this problem out of thin air, versus the conservative, the person who kind of has this holistic view of progress, this holistic view of change in the world, can recognize, oh, I need the minds of thousands of generations before me to even come close to addressing these issues. And the Christian would say, yeah, that apostolic deposit given by God, binding our consciences to that, binding our conscience to the faith that has endured the ages, is actually the best way of understanding any new problem that arises. But we actually have to treat that faith as the faith of ages. We can't just treat it as the momentary faith that solves our instant problem, the problem that we're having in this current moment. Otherwise, it actually will fail to do what we want it to do. Because if we don't have a holistic view of the apostolic deposit, we'll pick and choose and kind of end up making mistakes. And I think what ends up happening a lot of times is you'll see this kind of problem playing itself out in a stubborn and kind of minute way. What do I mean? Well, you'll see a lot of people talking about, the solution to this problem is ideological. So you'll see people, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, appealing to Protestants and saying, oh, you can recognize that this thing in the culture is bad. Well, if you think about it, it's actually rooted in Protestantism. So people today reject authority. Well, the Protestants, they rejected an authority once. And so, boom, they're there's more complicated webs than this. And actually, they're not the first people to do this. My point is, actually, in the early modern age, there were lots of people who saw the Protestant Reformation as the beginning of the modern age and as the progression into modernism. Most people would kind of, most neutral historians would start the modern age probably a little bit before the Renaissance, with the discovery of the New World and all of these things. But, there's a lot of stuff going on, actually, in that very small window before the Protestant Reformation, right? The Ottomans conquer Constantinople, all of the Greek literature comes into Italy, all of the Greek exiles come into Italy, there's Greek scholars. There's a discovery of the New World, and we kind of see the world as much bigger than we've seen it before. Trade and global connection makes Europe a lot richer per person, kind of coming out of the Black Death. There's a lot of more per capita wealth than there was before. All of these social changes, all of these material changes are in some sense responsible for the ideological change that occurs in the kind of humanist Renaissance. And then that humanism, it would be kind of silly to say that there's no connection between the kind of humanist group, the people who are humanists and sympathetic to the humanist movement, and the Protestants. And lots of Protestants have been proud of this. Lots of people have been not proud of this. I mean, depending on your opinion on humanism. But these issues, in some sense, have material rooting. And so you can kind of get into the materialist school of thinking. And this is where people like Karl Marx would have subscribed to. The Marxist school is what's called scientific materialism, or they call themselves that. But the idea is that the material conditions are what create ideology, not the other way around. So a lot of times we'll say, oh, here's the ideological family tree, and a materialist would say, no, you're stupid. Really, this was created by material conditions. And then the idealists, this school was popular in Germany, would basically say, actually, ideas kind of grow, and you kind of get Hegel with this, but all the characters are more complicated. Even Marx's opinions are more complicated, but they kind of start to get this idea that really ideas, ways of thinking, they dominate. So if you think a certain way, you can, new ideas spawn from previous ideas, and then those ways of thinking shape our material society. And so you get people talking in the modern age about, okay, well, did Protestantism create modernity? and some people saying, oh, Calvinism or Lutheranism or whatever, started the Enlightenment, and then the Enlightenment created this, and then the kind of shaking up piece, the piece of this that was the most kind of true, the work in this controversy that was the most lasting was Max Weber's work on this, called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, where he kind of answers this question like, okay, well, it looks like if you just look at a map, and me and Redeemed Umbra have talked about this actually before, but if you look at a map, the countries that embraced Protestantism the most, the ones that eventually embraced democracy the most, were Protestant countries. Today it's kind of mixed, right? Because you'll see actually the Protestant European countries are the ones that for the most part have kept their monarchies, but there's always been a little more of a liberal acceptance of liberal ethos, of a liberality, of democracy in some Protestant countries, and the idea of individual rights, private judgment as a right of an individual in a lot of these places. Some people have tried to say, oh, well, in there you can notice the disproportionate number of Scottish scientists in the Enlightenment and in that period because, oh, well, if they were Calvinistic, they would have understood that everything is a part of God's providence. So the scientific stuff is consistent. God's word is unchanging. We can study it and systematize it and all that kind of stuff. And so you might be swayed by that or not swayed by that. Same thing with Dutch people, maybe even the disproportionate number of Danish scientists, but also that starts to break down when you realize that, oh, there's a lot of Italian scientists and French scientists or whatever, but maybe they're influenced by Thomism, but I don't know, but it's not as cut and dry when you really start to systematize. And so what Max Weber kind of does is he talks about the mixed kind of feedback loop that goes on with materialism and idealism. If you read his work, which to be fair, I haven't actually read in a long time, but I read it in high school. I get the gist, if you will, and I think this is the main point he's trying to make is, okay, so Protestantism was embraced more readily in places that were more mercantile, and then that mercantile, because it was more apt. He talks about the idea of confirming your election by prosperity, all these kinds of things. He talks about John Calvin's Geneva being this very productive place. The way their attitude towards work was much more positive, right? In the Roman Catholic calendar, there were all these feast days where you couldn't work, and they took up huge swaths of the calendar, but the Calvinists got rid of those liturgical days. And really, in his opinion, actually, it's kind of Calvinism is the pure version of Protestantism and the Protestant work ethic production system. And then Catholicism over here, and then Lutheranism, Anglicanism, they're kind of in the middle of kind of pushing those things. But he points out, okay, well, the Puritans, the Dutch, the Scots, a lot of these people really embraced capitalism really early on, and you can see the kind of correlation, right? So in the English Civil War, for instance, there's this kind of bourgeois class against this nobility class, and the bourgeois class more readily embraced Congregationalism and Presbyterianism, Calvinist theologies, than the aristocracy, which kind of clung to a kind of high church Anglicanism, which was in some sense Laudian, is what we would call it now, but they were also identified as Arminian, less so because of soteriological reasons, but at the very least because of their opposition to the Calvinist kind of dogma of the time, right? And so kind of seeing, oh, there's actually some kind of class correlation here with the ideologies that they embrace, but then showing, okay, well, actually, even the places where Calvinism was embraced did then precipitate more kind of capitalization, embracing of capitalism, but also capitalism has its roots in all the other material things, and just kind of seeing this as a web of interconnected ideas that work together. Think about this. Today, we live in a world where we kind of have this, it's been called the urban monoculture, right? All over the world, you can go to very dense cities, talk to people who are kind of well-educated, upper income, from all over the world, and they sound more like people from completely other side of the planet who are from that exact same situation, right? Because they've traveled the world, they're very involved in international politics or this kind of things. They care about things like the environment. They've read a lot, and they sound more similar to each other, even if they're way up across the world, than that class of the urban monoculture is similar to their own, working classes in their own countries. So, kind of a liberal technocratic elite from London sounds very similar to an elite liberal technocratic person from Tunisia, right? And it's like, why is that? Versus, and then you go to Tunisia, right? The working class people are very different. They're all Muslim and all these kinds of things. They're very different than, say, an English working class person, but they're also more different than the urban monoculture. And really, that's, there's a sense of we're all kind of sharing these documents. They're all reading the same stuff, but also, I think a reasonable person would point out, hey, actually, if you look throughout human history, people who have lived in cities have always kind of been seen as, especially mercantile cities, people that were connected to the global world, were kind of seen as, more hedonistic. They were treated in similar ways. The stereotypes that rural America has about the coast, the liberal coastal elites, is actually the same stereotype that ancient Romans would have had about Corinthians or Athenians or people in the kind of connected Mediterranean world in these populated cities, right? That they were more hedonistic, they weren't as stoic, they weren't as hardworking, they got lax and lazy and soft, all that kind of stuff. That they knew a bunch of languages or whatever, but they didn't care as much about their native language, right? You can see in the history of Rome, the kind of conservatives, trying to bite back at the spread of the Greek language because they saw it as representing this kind of Greek laxity in culture or whatever. And the idea was that the noble Roman would have retired to the countryside and been, stepped away from that urban culture to kind of retreat to a more moral landscape where he could discipline himself. The same thing was true about, the English temperament. If you read Regency era novels, this is how they treat the countryside. Is it's more simple, it's more romantic, and also it's better for morals and people in cities. They can get debauched and dangerous. The Bible shares this kind of broad assumption. That's kind of the Sodom and Gomorrah story. There's the idea of Jerusalem as kind of this mixed, city of God, but also it gets debauched, and all of the good prophets and people are shepherds or people that have land and those kinds of things. Abraham and his descendants. So there's this contrast. You can see that contrast in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest tales we have still today, right? Gilgamesh represents the city of Ur, and he's kind of this urban tyrant character. And then you get Enkidu, who's this kind of rural, wild, free spirit who has to be tamed by civilization. And together they kind of make this, right? They teach each other important lessons about humanity, but whatever. Regardless, you kind of see that tension of the environment creating culture, and environment creating conditions, and the environment creating ways of thinking and developing how we are. And so, while it might be a valuable polemic, and I think in our time today, this idea of, the idealistic slippery slope is appealing, right? Okay, well, I want to stop people from doing what we find abhorrent in the modern culture today as Christians. How far back do I have to go? You start thinking, okay, well, I have this problem. You find it, you're afraid for sending your children to public schools, let's say, because you don't want the children to get kind of indoctrinated by the liberal public schools, and then you're worried. You can see all this research about how kind of the transgender idea can kind of be like an infection, right? Some of the kids get this idea that they're not the gender they were born as, and then they have to transition, and then you see some parents being, punished for not allowing their kids to transition genders, and like, how do I do that? I got to take my kids to the public school, and this is your concern as a burgeoning person, or you grew up in that public school system and you see just like, oh my gosh, nobody believes in objective reality anymore, nobody believes in objective truth anymore, everyone just does their own thing. There's this kind of no public decency. It's kind of a mentally irracinating way of living your life, and you're like, how can we solve this? And so you want to go back and you say, the 60s, you'll see a lot of people talk about this, the 60s had this kind of sexual liberationism, and this ideological way of thinking actually has a lot of connections to the way we're thinking now. And I think there's actually a lot of truth to that. You can see, this book influenced that person. We'll talk about like third wave, fourth wave, first wave feminism, and kind of the transition along those ways of thinking. And it seems like the genealogy is purely ideological. And there's definitely some truth to that. And so then you want to keep going back. Well, how did we get to feminism? Well, there was the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment started saying all this stuff about the equality of all people. And then right as soon as the Enlightenment is released, right, you get the Declaration of the Rights of Women, and you're like, oh, so it started with the Enlightenment. And what created the Enlightenment, right? And then you get, depending on your worldview, then it's like, oh, really, the Protestants started in the Enlightenment. But then if you get, if say you're a trad Lutheran or whatever, you'll notice, hey, actually the Jesuits are kind of the ones who are introducing this idea that you really can't know anything on your own. You have to trust the magisterium. You have to trust somebody. And then that kind of takes you into the Enlightenment way of thinking about what I've kind of called obscurantism, the idea that you really can't know anything. And then you get to like Kant, and he's like, how can we know anything, right? Can we? Is everything just about experience and how we experience the world? Is there anything objective? And then you get back to like the medieval era, and then you're like, oh, so say you're a Roman Catholic, oh, Protestantism is the problem. What created Protestantism? And then you find like, oh, there's a scholastic tradition called nominalism, which talked about how actually there are no forms. The things that we label in the world are really just located in our minds. So when I say book only exists in my mind. There's no book in the real world. There's just a collection of matter. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's the bad idea. That's the bad thing. That created the future world, and that created Protestantism, which created the Enlightenment, which created feminism, which created this, which created that, which created this, which created transhumanism, whatever your problem is. And then you're like, okay, gosh, how did we get to nominalism? And then, right, so say now you're a Roman Catholic, and you're looking at that, you're like, nominalism was the problem. We all got to be Thomists. But then say you're Eastern Orthodox persuaded, and you say, oh, really? Nominalism is just the consequence of this over-scholasticism. Everybody's getting too scholastic. And the scholastic tradition was deifying human reason. And so the scholastic way of thinking was the problem in itself. And what happened? How did the scholastic tradition begin? Well, it was actually this medieval practice that developed because of a certain type of monasticism, of academic monasticism, which really was a consequence of the split in 1054. And the split in 1054, oh my gosh, it was actually because the Charlemagne wanted to assert his power over the Roman Empress Irene, and so he had to elevate the office of the papacy to elevate himself. And so, and really, people do this. This is like a whole full worldview, and I'm not saying it's entirely wrong, but then you have to start again. When you think this way genealogically, ideologically, you can do those trains of thought, but it's ignoring a key reality of the world that's actually accurate, which is that the changes, the progress that goes on in the world happen when we respond to material changes. And in reality, every change point is actually an opportunity for reaction. And you can't really fundamentally go back to a pre-reaction stage. You have to choose your reaction now. So let's say there is this scholastic movement. There is this move to reason, let's say, and say that was the problem with it all. You can't go back to the previous state of Christianity where you don't have to have a stance on reason. In fact, if you really look at the Eastern response to scholasticism at the time, there was this tendency to a kind of mystical thinking, a kind of hesychasm, the idea that you really, preference for apophatic ways of talking about God. This is kind of a divide between the East and the West. And again, you can't not take a stance now because this controversy has arisen. You have to pick one, and you have to talk about them. And then even within the scholastic tradition, right, nominalism versus realism. Now you have to fork your way in the path, right? Nominalism, which I talked about earlier, is the idea that there aren't real forms in the world. They're just located in our head, right? Realism being that there are real forms. The forms are real. They have a location in the mind of God, which makes them real, or, whatever your understanding of realism might be. And so you have to kind of pick this way of thinking in reaction to a change in real progress. And a lot of times, these ways of thinking are actually just justifying a change we already wanted to happen. Think about the urban kind of monoculture. I'll talk about this in a second. Think about the urban monoculture I was talking about before. Why is it that people in cities tend to kind of react a certain way? They have this reputation for being licentious or hedonistic. Well, they can afford it, right? Cities are the center of resources a lot of times. You can make a lot of money in cities. And so people who have the power and the wealth to behave in certain ways often are more likely to do so. And once they can, they often want to justify it, right? Imagine a world where everybody was constantly sleeping around or being an adulterer, but they thought it was horrible. that just is so much more tension. What wouldn't it be that much easier if we thought, oh, actually, here's how I can morally justify being a adulterer. Here's how I can morally justify being doing the things I already wanted to do. Versus in the countryside, there's a little bit of a tension there because they probably live thousands of miles away, especially for depending on the point in human history, right? Say you're in a not very urbanly dense area. The guy who is isolated, think of like Little House on the Prairie. That the husband, his wife, his children, they're for miles on miles and miles. There's nobody else. That guy literally couldn't be an adulterer if he wanted to be. You know what I mean? Like he's stuck with his wife, and so he can entertain himself and he can feel more pleased. And I'm not saying that's the only reason these things don't happen, but also think about it, right? The guy in the rural environment has to work very hard for everything that he gets. He builds in himself a stronger work ethic. You can also think of like kind of the monarchy trope, which people have observed over history, where it's like the first generation is a conqueror and he takes over the kingdom, and then his son grows up. Maybe he remembers the time before they were emperors, and he's a little bit more of a mixed bag. And then the third generation, though, he grew up in the life of luxury as the son of an emperor, and so then by the third emperor, it's all chaos now, right? There's no discipline. He's a bad emperor, and then the empire falls. And there's longer time scales and shorter time scales for that little process, right? You've probably seen the meme where it's like, bad men create hard times create good men create good times create bad men or weak men, right? And then the weak men create bad times, all that stuff. And that's kind of a cycle. And you can find historians going back to ancient Rome who have observed that kind of a trend. And so that's a material way of thinking. If you think about it, that's just saying, oh, the material conditions affect how people live their lives. And so if you realize, oh, wait, it's a material condition that created the Enlightenment, you actually have to acknowledge and accept the material condition and then provide a counter. You have to provide, how would we reject the Enlightenment? You can see, for instance, neo-Orthodox theologians defending their position this way. So they want to preserve orthodoxy, as they say. So they have to kind of accept some of the language of modernism. They have to kind of accept some of the ideas of modernism or this, that, the other thing, so that we can move past these issues. And instead of the kind of fundamentalist instinct, which is to say, well, I don't want to think about those things. I'm just gonna keep thinking what we've thought for hundreds of years and not have an opinion on this or not develop an opinion on this. And I think that instinct is difficult. And to get back to the kind of what my audience might care about, right? Religious denominations, Calvinism, right? So did Calvinism create the modern world? It seems like a lot of people think that. But then, in my opinion, if you can find basically, and I made this tweet, which I think captures it pretty well, you can find kind of mainline progressive Calvinists who will point out, or you can find secular, let's start here, secular progressives who will talk about like the Puritans and how they founded our country and their backward sexual culture has ruined America and we're all prudes, which, like, sure. But that's a whole other conversation. And then you can find kind of neo-reactionary people who talk about Calvinism and ultra-Calvinism. And they'll say, oh, actually, Calvinism was the beginning of liberalism because this, that, and the other thing. And then you can find, mainline Calvinists who will basically say, oh, actually, Calvinism was the beginning of liberalism, and they're really positive about it, right? And they agree with the neo-reactionaries, but disagree with their contemporary progressives who crap on the Puritans or whatever, for instance. You can find, I think it's Atun Shea. He's a YouTuber who talks a lot about American history, and he's pretty liberal, but he's not as far off as some other YouTubers. I happen to like his content, but of course I disagree with him on politics and Christianity or whatever. But he has a video talking about how the Puritans founded American democracy, and he's pretty positive about it, right? So you can find those mixed different views on these different things, and he has criticisms of Puritans. Obviously, he's not a Puritan, but you can find the variety of views, and then you can find right-wing Calvinists, and I think Abraham Kuyper is a great example of this, but especially very pro-American history Calvinists who will basically say, hey, Presbyterians, we founded the Republican model of government that we have today. Hey, us Presbyterians, we did this. Abraham Kuyper, I'm not all the way through his lectures, but they're called lectures on Calvinism, but really they're on his like political theory, and he has the same kind of idea of a genealogy of ideas. He talks about ideas Calvin invented about individual responsibility, and that really the fundamental relationship between man and God is an individual relationship, and that talks about individual responsibility, and he says that's kind of the American ethos and the Dutch ethos that he's eventually he's prime minister of the Netherlands, right? He kind of thinks of Calvinists as having invented the modern world and is very proud of that. But you can find all kinds of different people who will say this, who will say that, right? I can imagine an alternative argument of, oh, Calvinists believe in predestination, so really they're to blame for people being morally lax because, oh, if I'm damned, I'm damned. If I'm not, I'm not. I'm not, and it doesn't matter what I do. But instead, it just seems like, oh, well, we don't. Obviously, that's not what happened because we can tell that Calvinists, in Calvinist countries like the Netherlands and Switzerland and the Puritans in Scotland or whatever, they all were very productive materially. They were very hardworking countries historically. Parts of Germany that embraced Protestantism were much more economically productive than Catholic countries. So it's obvious that that's not how it went, but you can imagine a justification for that. So a lot of these things would be worried about kind of a post hoc justification, in my opinion, which is tempting, because we want a narrative. We want to narrativize our history, which is not a bad thing, but you kind of have to worry about it. Then you can think of, Thomas Carlyle, who was raised Calvinist. He was a Scottish guy. We'll talk about actually there are people who have an oversized impact on the course of history. He calls it hero worship or something like that. The idea that there's these standout individuals who make, you couldn't have accounted for Napoleon. Napoleon isn't a material effect. He's not even really an idealist effect. He took advantage of material conditions, but he was also an amazing general. And if he hadn't been, maybe the French Revolution would have gone differently. And think about, oh my gosh, all the different things that would have happened in human history if Napoleon never got into charge, or Caesar, or any of these other characters. And there's that mix. But of course, anyone who tried to paint a picture where it's just these cool supermen who change history, it's like, well, how would Napoleon or Caesar have risen to power without the political instability that was going on in the time, which is really related to these material conditions and this historical, ideological change. And so really all of these different factors are kind of weighing in together. They're competing. They're all playing into this web of how history plays out. And we have to have our responses to all of those different things. How would we respond to a despotic leader? How would we respond to a charismatic leader? How would we respond to this material change? Would we embrace capitalism or reject capitalism? You can find that, Catholic social teaching exists that wouldn't have had to exist hundreds of years before capitalism, but now it addresses, okay, well, how should you treat your employees and all of these other things? And that's about development of doctrine. And so at the end of the video, I have to plug for Anglicanism, because in a way, I do think that Anglicanism, people will criticize, oh, Anglicans, they have this relationship with Calvinism, and they've taken this and they've rejected that. And they have this relationship with Lutheranism, and they've taken this and rejected that. And they have this relationship with Roman Catholicism, and they've taken this and they rejected that. And it's kind of like, and then, people, one of the big boogeymen of Anglicanism is, in the Anglican tradition, there was a kind of one of the earliest moments of embracing contraceptives. I think it's in the 70s, a Lambeth Declaration, when the communion was still working together, that said, okay, there are some cases where, under the guidance of a spiritual director, couples can use contraceptives. And really the reason they had to make that decree is because contraceptives exist now, right? Versus, I think a lot of Roman Catholics are very proud of the fact that their magisterium has just wholesale rejected contraceptives, because they see it as being a better reaction. Why? Because contraceptives, in a way, have detached, and I think this is true in our society, because you can have sex without having a child now. There's not always the risk of having a child. People feel like they can have sex whenever they want. They've detached this incredibly personal act. That we would, as Christians, say belongs in the bonds of marriage, and they've said, oh, it really doesn't matter. It's really just about having fun, and they blame contraceptives for that. And I think that's true. But really ask yourself this: Has Roman Catholicism's stance against contraceptives changed how it's affected our culture? Are all Roman Catholic countries, completely rejecting contraceptives? In fact, I think the only regime that's been the most successful at rejecting contraceptives was the Romanian Communist Party, because they wanted to increase the population growth. As an example, I can really think of. I actually just remembered that someone sent me this a little bit ago, but really think about this. This is the Catholic teaching, right? To what extent does it actually have an effect on people who identify as Catholic? Now, we could talk about people who really take it seriously, but think about societal impact-wise. What has more of an effect, the teaching the kind of cultural identity or the material things, because you can look at what do actual on the ground identifying Roman Catholics believe about birth control, contraceptives, gay marriage, women priests, all that other kind of stuff. And there is a nobility in being able to resist that kind of popular wave. I totally want to grant that, but really this is just only bringing this up to point out the culture, the material world we live in has an effect on the way people think, and just having a based trad ideology doesn't necessarily solve these things. We have to have a response, and we have to have an address, and we have to have we have to have a conflict there, and maybe that conflict is resolved in the way that it's supposed to be resolved in the Roman Catholic magisterium. But you can't avoid these battles. You can't avoid the developments that have occurred in our society. You have to respond to them. Really, you have to respond to them. So that's my main critique of the trad way of thinking. And I would say that if you're willing to consider things like the Protestant Reformation a kind of development, if you're willing to understand Calvinism as a development, or Arminianism, or the rituals involved in everyday life of Christianity, which I would say completely, this is why I would consider myself in some sense a ritualist, or someone who supports high church liturgy, all that kind of stuff. Those things are developments that respond to the human condition, and that's why they have value. That's why we need them. They're not just optional, right? And so I would say Anglicanism in some sense has been able to respond to these things. I was just talking about how the global communion of Anglicans actually have had to respond to a lot of the innovations in modernism and in theological liberalism, because parts of our community have embraced it. Really, it feels like a huge amount, but from a global perspective, it's only like 15% of the Anglican communion are even really struggling with these issues. But the rest, the global context, that broader perspective, which in some ways is smarter than our local perspective, is able to correct those smaller contexts and to say, hey, here's what's actually important, here's what's not important, right? You can imagine, to get back to the CREC, they feel like all of the questions of our day, and the question of Calvinism, right, probably because they're very, theologically interested evangelicals who are constantly debating Calvinism with other evangelicals. These are the important issues. These are the dividing lines. These are the things that society needs strong and clear answers on. Versus, does society need a strong and clear answer on paedobaptism? Well, to them, it doesn't seem like the dividing line, so no. But really immersing yourself in a tradition won't allow you to do that, because what traditions are these amalgamated answers to the problems that spring up in the human condition over time that never really go away. And having answers to them is better than not. And you can really see that a lot of people feel unsatisfied in the kind of non-denominational, right? What is the restorationist instinct in Christianity, the kind of non-denominational Campbellite instinct? Well, if we don't have theology, we can't divide on it, so that's good. But then, I know so many people who grew up in that context, and they thought Christianity was dumb. They thought it just doesn't have any answers. Nobody thinks about anything in this religion, and they abandoned it without really being able to embrace, hey, actually, all of the problems in your life, they have an answer in the gospel. Christ addresses them. Being in Christ is the solution. God wants a relationship with you so that he can reconcile you to creation and to himself. Primarily to himself, and then to creation, and we can talk about justification and sanctification, all those things. But really, that's the goal here. That's what we're saying is happening in our religion. And if we ignore that, then, what's the point? And so if we abandon the tradition, if we abandon this kind of broader context, we lose an evangelical aspect of our religion. We lose an apologetic aspect of our religion. We lose a relative. We lose an important. We lose the religion, and we shouldn't do that, and we can't do that. And that instinct has to kind of go. So that's my thoughts on this. Hopefully this video was helpful. If you liked the video, be sure to like the video. If you want to see more of my content, be sure to subscribe, hit the little bell button, and you'll get notified every time I upload a new video. If you want to support me, you can support me over at younganglican.locals.com still, and you'll get access to videos before I upload them on YouTube. If you're a supporter on Locals, you also get, to take part in Q&As and stuff like that I do on there. So if you want to support me, do that. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and God bless.